You know, we often talk between ourselves, us fellas, and we couldn't say that we were living actually in the air. Now I'm talking about 1914 and the winter of 1914-15. You couldn't say that we were living in the sense of the word. It was sheer punishment.
There's our barrage, the Germans' barrage, and over the top we go. As soon as you get over the top, fear has left you. It's terror. You don't look, you see. You don't hear, you listen. Your nose is filled with fumes and death. You taste the top of your mouth. The veneer of civilization has dropped away.
We were told it is expected of 50% casualties. Part of your thoughts is self-preservation. And unfortunately, self-preservation is always at a cost of somebody else. There's always a memory of a couple of the lads who hit the beach, of just, they'd gone down. Whether they got up, I don't know.
We arrived in the middle of the night, and in Auschwitz you could smell the fear. You really could smell it. And we had to go through selection. We didn't know it was selection, but that's what it was. Mengele, whom you may have heard, was standing there, and he looked at you and then sent you to the left or to the right. The left was the side for living and the right was the side for gas.
Et je dois vous dire, tout homme que je suis, seulement un homme, je suis content que ça c'est derrière nous, et je suis sûr que la génération ou les générations après nous ne feront plus des choses tellement inutiles, parce que nous savons maintenant ce que c'était. Nous l'avons fait 2 fois, la guerre, surtout entre la France et entre l'Allemagne. Nous n'avons rien du tout à nous envier, à nous prendre, et j'espère, quand je fermerai mes yeux, après moi, ce ne sera pas le déluge de 14-18.
The political and economic alliances that characterised the beginning of the 21st century grew from the blood, rubble and ashes of the world wars. The redivision of territories between great powers was complete, with the United States taking the mantle as the dominant power of the imperialist world. As a direct consequence of the war's destruction, capital found new life. The exceptional economic period following the war is known as the post-war boom. The crisis of over-accumulation and profitability that had predicated the wars was temporarily undone by their violence. Across Europe and Japan, huge swathes of crisis-ridden capital were destroyed in an avalanche of bombs and bullets. This allowed for profitable reinvestment in the construction of new factories, new machinery, and new enterprises. Technologies developed in the process of redividing the world allowed for a far higher rate of productivity than those that had been destroyed, increasing the amount of value produced and profit derived from reinvestment. The immense devaluation of currencies during the war ensured that the money capital required to invest in these areas was cheap and a steady flow of investment possible. Just as a flower grows best in the compost of its dead brothers, capital grew well among the graves of its former self. Fascism also aided in the construction of the post-war boom. Whilst it claims to be many things, the political meaning of fascism is very simple. It is the raw, uncloaked barbarity of capitalist society. In Germany and Italy, this is very clear. Rather than coming to power upon the basis of its own energy or class, Fascism was aided into power by the capitalist class for the purpose of suppressing the powerful workers' movements which arose in these nations during the interwar period. It obliged to this purpose dutifully, destroying trade unions and violently dispersing working class organisations. The consequences of this repression for the post-war period were low wages and a working class so exhausted that resistance to such an increased rate of exploitation was all but impossible. The dark clouds that encircled the Earth between 1914 and 1945 were not, however, immovable. Light first pierced their canopy in 1917 with the victory of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the formation of the Soviet Union, the world's first socialist state. By 1945, socialism had spread far into Europe. Whilst the USSR was by no means perfect, and its excesses of violence and mistakes of political economy must be learnt from, it represented the most powerful force of resistance to imperialism that the world had ever seen. The political threat posed by the communist world was not simply that of the destruction of one imperialist nation's capital, but the destruction of capital entirely. Further, it gave enormous support to anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist movements across the globe, which directly threatened the ability of imperialist capital to expand into oppressed nations. The combination of these factors led to the formation of an alliance between imperialist powers, with the US at its head. Economically, this formation was of the same substance as the international capitalist associations which had formed during the initial division of the world between imperialists. Using a combination of capital exports and financial aid to European states, the US both secured its dominance and brought about a general increase in the rate of profit. Profits were divided between the imperialists according to their relative competitive positions in the world market. The alliance gained a military expression with the formation of NATO in 1949. However, competition between these powers continued to operate even through this alliance. The most significant expression of this was the formation of the European Economic Community, or EEC, in 1957. Introduced by the Treaty of Rome, the EEC brought Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the German Federal Republic into a common market and a customs union. Although these moves were initially supported by US imperialism, they were brought about by the collective need of mainland Europe to band together in order to remain able to compete with the US. As such, it laid the basis for what would become one of the US's largest competitors, that is, the European Union. As the post-war boom was brought about by the destruction of the wars, it clearly could not last forever. The destruction of masses of capital during the war laid the ground for new capital investment and a return to profitability. However, as this new capital accumulated, it laid the basis for a future crash. Sure enough, by 1974, the post-war boom had ended and capitalism returned to crisis, with Britain, the US, and Japan all recording negative GDP growth, a trend that continues to this day. This return to crisis conditions marked the beginning of an economic period known to many bourgeois academics as neoliberal globalization. Its promises were nothing less than the creation of one global, borderless, stateless market. This was a lie.
And I would just like to remember some words of St. Francis of Assisi, which I think are really just particularly apt at the moment. Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
The economic ills we suffer have come upon us over several decades. They will not go away in days, weeks, or months, but they will go away. They will go away because we, as Americans, have the capacity now, as we've had in the past, to do whatever needs to be done to preserve this last and greatest bastion of freedom. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Las Fuerzas Armadas y de Orden han actuado en el día de hoy solo bajo la inspiración patriótica de sacar al país del caos que en forma aguda lo estaba precipitando el gobierno marxista de Salvador Allende. La Junta mantendrá el poder judicial y la asesoría de la Contraloría. Las cámaras quedarán en receso hasta nueva orden.
This is the National Stadium in Santiago de Chile. For nearly 2 months after the CIA-backed coup against the anti-imperialist, socialist-leaning Allende government on the 11th of September 1973, it served as a concentration camp. Over 12,000 working-class people, trade unionists, and immigrants were interned here over those 2 months. They were beaten, interrogated, tortured, and shot, whilst Chile's capitalist class celebrated with champagne parties. Though the official statistics say that only 47 people were murdered, truly, it is unknown how many people died here. It is said that many people were shot and wounded, then dragged away to be murdered elsewhere. And so it is that they rest, forever entombed in anonymity. The economic policy of Pinochet's rule was not designed in Chile, but here, in the economics department of the University of Chicago. During the 1950s, the department operated not only as a school, but self-consciously as a school of thought. The school was vehemently opposed to the state welfare systems that had formed in most of the world's imperialist powers after the end of the Second World War. Though these structures were far from socialist, funded by the breadcrumbs of colonial and imperialist exploitation, they prevented certain areas of the economy from being opened for private investment. The department's students and graduates, known collectively as the Chicago Boys, marched as an intellectual army, arguing for a pure capitalism free of any government regulations, trade barriers, or entrenched interests. At the head of this army was the economist Milton Friedman. Chile was his test lab.
Chile was a case in which a military regime headed by Pinochet was willing to switch the organization of the economy from a top-down to a bottom-up performance, and in that process a group of people who had been trained at the University of Chicago in the Department of Economics, who came to be called the Chicago Boys, played a major role in designing and implementing the economic reforms. I was not an advisor to Pinochet, I was not an advisor to the Chilean government, but I am more than willing to share in the credit for the extraordinary job that our students did down there.
Friedman not only believed dogmatically in the sanctity of the market, he thought he knew how to get there. Shock therapy. The idea behind this term is that by stimulating an economic contraction by mass privatization, sell-offs, and the removal of trade barriers, it is possible to change the behaviour of a nation, forcing wages and prices to stagnate. Then, the logic of pure capitalism asserts itself, creating a nation of owners. Pinochet's dictatorship allowed freedmen a chance to test this theory. The result was dire for the Chilean working class, with unemployment increasing tenfold and Chile's industrial sector contracting to a size around that it had been during the Second World War. For US imperialism, however, Pinochet and freedmen succeeded in the objective of destroying the gains made by the Allende government and opening Chile to super-exploitation. It was a success. The economic rationale underpinning Friedman's theory, that is, the destruction of the state to open new markets, found its chance to shine in the imperialist nations with the election of Margaret Thatcher as the Prime Minister of Britain in 1979 and Ronald Reagan as President of the US in 1981. More than 40 state-owned businesses employing over 60,000 workers were sold, and Britain's council housing opened up to private purchase by the Thatcher government before her departure in 1990.
The homeless were homeless, you might say, by choice.
Reagan created 2 million homeless with his decision to cut the budget of the Department of Housing, fired 11,359 striking air traffic controllers and smashed their union, and cut the top tax rate from 70% to 28% in 7 years. This strategy of austerity, privatisation and union smashing became known as neoliberalism. With the defeat of the miners' strike in Britain in 1985, it had steamrolled any opposition. A hungry, crisis-ridden capital sustained itself upon the carcass of the state.
I seen all riot police, I seen them all come over at walls when miners weren't doing it and they had them penned in down there. I was stood here talking and then miners weren't even saying a word. And they got a bloke down there and he must have been 40-year-old like I just said. And they wouldn't let him up, there were 6 of them kicking hell out of him and all coppers scattered rest at pickets.
The red flag came down over the Kremlin tonight as President Gorbachev resigned and brought to an end 7 decades of communist rule in the Soviet Union.
With the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, imperialism was again able to expand across essentially the whole sphere of the globe. Whilst the ransacking of the state continued, capital exports and the expansion of credit drove imperialist development in this period. For example, in 1995, foreign direct investment outflows increased by an enormous 38% to $317 billion, with a record $100 billion going to countries in the so-called Third World. This investment was concentrated in 3 blocks: the US, Japan, and Europe. 76% of the investment in Third World countries between 1993 and 1995 brought dividends to only 10 imperialist nations. Far from the promised global, borderless, stateless market, this process more resembled that seen in Chile, that is, the violent ransacking of oppressed nations by imperialist capitalism. For Europe, and particularly a reunified Germany, the significance of this process was enormous. Previously hemorrhaged by the Soviet Union, German capital was now able to expand into Eastern Europe, whilst France further expanded into Southern Europe. It should come as no surprise that over the same period, the EU began to make moves to consolidate itself as a bloc capable of combating US imperialism. The Treaty of the European Union was signed at Maastricht in December 1991, leading to the creation of a European Central Bank by July 1998 and a common European currency by January 1999. The economic period of neoliberal globalization represented nothing more and nothing less than the rapid division of the world between imperialist powers. The alliance between US, European and British imperialism that had developed during the post-war period could be sustained and even formally deepened throughout this due to the relatively open field left in the wake of communism's destruction. However, as Lenin wrote, under imperialism, peaceful alliances prepare the ground for wars. This period of expansion could not continue forever. The world is no more infinite now than it was in 1914. Once the earth runs out, nothing is possible but a redivision of territories by the test of strength. Over 2015 and 2016, the G20 countries introduced a record number of trade restrictive measures, undoing the foundation of globalization. The earth had run out. Imperialism today is on the verge of the largest crisis in its history. As Marx predicted, the rate of profit has fallen and continues to reach towards zero. This is an observable reality. In the 1870s, the general world rate of profit stood at around 43%. By the 2000s, this had fallen to around 17%. This, combined with the all but complete division of the world between imperialist powers, means that imperialist capital is increasingly unable to find a profitable investment. In consequence, overaccumulation is at an all-time high. This is expressed in ever-increasing inequality and rising global debt, as capital that is unable to find profitable investment is hoarded. The rise of the so-called developing nations, particularly Russia and China, has further exacerbated this problem, with these economies accounting for 60% of global GDP in purchasing power, compared to 44% before the 2008 banking crash. The overaccumulation of capital and barriers to investment have in fact become so great that the only way to restore the accumulation process is by launching the largest and most destructive war in humanity's history. On the 19th of January 2018, it fell to the US Defense Secretary, James Mattis, to give this process toward world confrontation a clear political expression.
Today, America's military reclaims an era of strategic purpose, and we're alert to the realities of a changing world and attentive to the need to protect our values and the countries that stand with us. America's military protects our way of life, and I want to point out it also protects a realm of ideas. It's not just about protecting geography. This is a defense strategy that will guide our efforts in all realms. The world, to quote George Shultz, is awash in change, defined by increasing global volatility and uncertainty, with great power competition between nations becoming a reality once again. So we will continue to prosecute the campaign against terrorists that we're engaged in today, but great power competition, not terrorism, is now the primary focus of U.S. national security.